Welcome to the Real News Network. I'm Sharmini Perez, coming to you from Baltimore. On Monday, President of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro, met with Pope Francis and announced that the Vatican will mediate talks between the government of Nicolas Maduro and the official opposition that controls the National Assembly. The two sides are expected to meet in Margarita Island this weekend, along with the Vatican, UNASUR, which is a regional bloc of South American countries, and 3 former heads of states. Pro-government activists stormed Venezuela's opposition-controlled legislature on Sunday in a protest against the legislature's effort to begin an impeachment process against President Nicolas Maduro. Tensions between the opposition and the government have significantly increased in Venezuela over the past few days, ever since the country's electoral authority, the CNE, suspended a referendum process to recall President Maduro. Here is what Hector Rodriguez, the leader of the pro-government Socialist Party faction in the National Assembly, had to say about the protests.
Nos han hecho perder el tiempo hoy. Es un intento chimbo, burdo, de copiar el golpe de Estado de Brasil o de copiar el golpe de Estado de Paraguay o de Honduras. En Venezuela no hay condiciones para que ellos impongan un golpe de Estado.
Joining us now from Caracas, Venezuela, to talk about these recent developments is Lucas Koerner. Lucas is a writer for Venezuelanalysis.com who has been living in Venezuela for almost 2 years now. Thanks for joining us, Lucas.
Hi, Sharmini. Great to be with you.
Lucas, let's begin with the recall referendum process. On Thursday, the CNE suspended the signature collection process because the Supreme Court confirmed that there were problems with the procedure for initiating the referendum in 5 of Venezuela's 24 states. Give us a brief rundown on what this was about, and does this mean that there will be no recall referendum at all?
Well, I think the first thing you have to understand is that Venezuela, in contrast to the vast number of countries in the world, and particularly the countries of the global north, has a procedure to convoke a recall referendum against the sitting president. However, it's a complicated constitutional procedure and requires much diligence and timing on the part of the opposition that convokes it. So what you had earlier this year was, as an initial part of the initial request to launch this procedure, the opposition had to collect signatures from 1% of the electorate in each and every one of Venezuela's 24 states. However, in the course of doing this, it was discovered that despite the opposition itself pledging that it had vetted these signatures, that 50,000 of these signatures, of the minimum needed to pass this threshold being 200,000, 1% of the electorate, were fraudulent. 55,000 signatures. Among them, we see 10,000 signatures belonging to deceased people, 10,995 deceased persons, 9,333 non-existent persons, 3,003 children, and 1,335 felons. So this obviously was an act of fraud in the context of this procedure. And in order to then move on to the formal collection of 20% of the electorate, of signatures from the electorate, which is necessary to trigger the actual referendum, the opposition had to have this 1% correct and vetted. And it was released earlier this year that these signatures were fraudulent. And just recently, courts in various of Venezuela's states have, at the state level, have presented cases against, involving, opened up investigations into this fraudulent activity. And as a result, the process as a whole, since it has to take place at a national level, cannot go forward until these cases at a state level are resolved. The Venezuela Supreme Court upheld these local decisions, and the CNE has announced that it is not suspended, but the recall referendum is postponed. The procedure for actually to trigger it, that is the collection of 20% of the electorate, 3.8 million signatures that was supposed to happen this coming week, is postponed until this investigation into these prior 1% of signatures can be finalized.
Right, and this was, of course, the Supreme Court now deeming this process unconstitutional because of the number of signatures that were considered fraudulent. How stacked is the Supreme Court in favor of the government?
I mean, there's no doubt that in December 2015, the outgoing Chavista majority parliament had named new Supreme Court justices in order to guarantee the stability and have a favorable Supreme Court to the government in the coming for the next period. And there's no doubt that the opposition can complain about that. It clearly was a political move that was, aimed at securing the judicial support for the government. Nonetheless, there was nothing fraudulent or unconstitutional about that naming. It was fully in, any parliament in the world, any lame duck Congress that names, makes decisions like this, that passes laws, etc.
So turning to the protests in the National Assembly, as we saw in the brief clip in the introduction, the governing Socialist Party is saying that the opposition is seeking to impeach President Maduro, as it happened in Brazil. So in the past, this kind of effort has been attempted in Venezuela, but it hasn't been possible because, at least during this Chavista era, it hasn't been possible because the National Assembly was always controlled by the ruling party. But it is possible, and they did it in Brazil, they can do it in Venezuela. What's standing in their way?
I think what's very interesting is to compare the current declaration that was just issued by the National Assembly yesterday with the proclamation that was issued by President Pedro Carmona, who was the president that was appointed, he came to power through the 2002 coup. He was the president of Fede Cámaras, of the Chamber of Commerce, and he issued a decree when he came to president that basically fired all of the Supreme Court justices, dissolved the parliament, and was to name basically against the Constitution. This document is quite similar in the sense that it likewise seeks to fire all of the CNE rectors, all the Supreme Court justices, that you may have your criticisms about their politics, but they were appointed constitutionally. It also calls on the Supreme Court on the armed forces to defend the Constitution, and whatever that means, because the opposition has been calling very frequently in the past months for the armed forces to intervene, presumably to topple the Maduro government. Also, the Constitution says that there is a process and there is in process an investigation to determine the probable double nationality of the president, which implies that they're accusing President Maduro of being Colombian and therefore of not being loyal to the country, which obviously resembles the birther conspiracy theory against Obama in the United States. So this is a very ominous document in many ways, and has very, very anti-democratic, and certainly the comparisons to both Brazil and Paraguay, and also to the procedure that the parliamentary or the judicial coup that overthrew Manuel Zelaya in Honduras in 2009 is also very clear comparisons.
Lucas, turning to the National Assembly and the comments that Hector Rodriguez just made, what is the opposition trying to do in terms of this attempted coup d'etat against President Maduro? How are they going about doing it, and for what reason?
I mean, clearly they're trying to take advantage, suspiciously take advantage of the fact that President Maduro is out of the country on an international oil tour, in order to have a Sunday meeting with the hope that no one will pay attention on a Sunday, no one will come out to oppose it, to push through this document that seeks to impeach President Maduro, but without really any constitutional legitimacy, because to postpone the recall referendum, pointing to real fraudulent practices that were committed in the course of the procedure, is not grounds for impeaching the president. Neither is being Colombian, and neither is the supposedly the politicized activity of the CNE rectors of the Supreme Court. So those are not grounds for impeachment. And I think, to refer to your previous question, that what is preventing in contrast to Brazil, in contrast to Paraguay, in contrast to Honduras, what is stopping this parliamentary coup from going forward is the people. It's the people, the masses of Chavista supporters who gathered outside of the Venezuelan parliament yesterday and stormed the parliament, refusing to allow this clearly conspiratorial effort by the Venezuelan opposition to oust the president. So I think that is the only guarantee. That this should be a lesson not only to the opposition but to the government, that the only guarantee that this government in power are its masses of supporters that largely come from Venezuela's impoverished. And only by solving this crisis in a way that can improve the lot of these people, only by doing that can the government hold on to power.
Now, as far as the referendum process is concerned, is the process suspended, and will it proceed?
I think that officially the process is postponed until these investigations into the 1% of signatures and in each of these states determine these fraudulent cases can be determined. So it's unclear at one point the process will be resumed. But I think it's important to keep in mind that it's a very time-sensitive process. That if a recall referendum is not held before January 10th, 2017, President Nicolas Maduro cannot be revoked. He can be revoked from office. However, new presidential elections will not take place. He will be replaced by his vice president, and therefore rendering a recall referendum beyond that date effectively a moot point. So the opposition, the hope of the opposition has always been to hopefully have recall referendum this year, have new presidential elections, and likely win them given the deep unpopularity of the government as a result of a very severe economic crisis. However, that does not seem to be taking place, and for a number of reasons, both due to the opposition's own errors, its foot dragging in beginning the process, and the government's obviously politicized attempts to delay the process because it does not want to lose the recall referendum, and nor can it be blamed.
And one final question, where is the Organization of American States at in terms of this effort by the opposition to bring about a coup against the president of Venezuela, Maduro?
The head of the OAS, Luis Almagro, has been working hand in hand with the Venezuelan opposition since he assumed the helm of that organization last year. Of course, on the promise that he was going to remake the organization and distance itself from the United States, and trying to repolish its very tarnished reputation. However, he announced yesterday that he would be pursuing international sanctions against Venezuela, and obviously, I think that there's going to be another attempt to apply the democratic charter against Venezuela, to expel it from the organization, just as Cuba was expelled in 1961. Similarly, as we saw earlier this year, Almagro tried to push through that measure. However, it was ultimately voted down by a majority of member states, which kind of speaks to the fact that despite the rightward shift of the region, there still is a solid majority of countries that oppose, applying this, measure against Venezuela, which is obviously hypocritical in the sense that Almagro has been silent vis-a-vis Brazil, where there evidently has been a parliamentary coup, and he has also been silent via the fraudulent election, with regard to the fraudulent elections in Haiti. So it has very little footing to really be speaking about democracy in Venezuela at this moment.
Right, as illegitimate as it may be for the people at the National Assembly to try to bring about a coup against a democratically elected president of Venezuela, their position might be strengthened right now by the economic situation in Venezuela. People are having a very rough time getting basic food and services and basic supplies needed for living. Is the economic situation improving with the improvement of the oil prices?
I think the situation continues to be very hard and very difficult for people. I think it also depends regionally. I would say that in general terms, there have been some improvements with the arrival of certain personal care items, like toilet paper and women's sanitary pads, etc., that has definitely alleviated a lot of difficulties for many people in accessing those goods. And I think that the government's actually, when we look at the most recent statistics, Maduro's popularity has increased over the last 2 months, with a majority of people calling for him to stay in power and resolve the economic situation, and also I believe over 60% of the population supporting the government's local provision and production committees, which are basically neighborhood initiatives between the government and local grassroots movements to supply food and other essential items direct house to house. Obviously, it's very uneven, and some areas have received much greater resources than others. However, there's larger numbers of people are starting to both support it and see that it is having some impact, at least.
Lucas, why is it that the government is having such a difficult time providing basic needs for its population? After all, this is not a poor country. Sure, oil has taken a dip, but there's no other priority than the basic needs of the people of Venezuela.
Yeah, I think that it's important to understand that Venezuela is a country that, as an oil exporting country that depends 96%, 96% of its export earnings come from oil. It imports the vast majority of essential goods, including food and other critical items. And that when the price of oil collapses, as it has over the past year and a half, this clearly debilitates the government's ability to import essential goods. So the government has slashed imports quite drastically over the past 2 years, in fact, and particularly over the last year. And this is particularly due to the fact that the government has had massive bond payments and other debt payments on both PDVSA and its own debt that it has had to make. Looking at a failed bond swap that they've just tried to push forward, billions and billions in obligations. But I think that what's really important to recognize is that Venezuela is not alone in facing this collapse of oil prices. Countries like Nigeria, countries like Saudi Arabia have also been hurting from this crisis. However, they have benefited from international loans to help them buffer this liquidity problem, because that's what it is, a liquidity problem. And Venezuela has oil for 300 years. However, it cannot turn it into money right away. So the problem is there are clearly, as economist Francisco Rodriguez, a former Bank of America Merrill Lynch economist, has pointed out, that most loans to Venezuela have to be banks providing credit to Venezuela, particularly serving as brokers, as Bank of America has served as a broker to Venezuela's debt payments, has to be approved by the United States. I mean, that does pass the United States. So what we're looking at is an informal financial embargo against Venezuela. And this is not just leftist conspiracy theory. This is the former lead economist for Bank of America. And this is very different from Cuba, for example, when you see a very real embargo that hopefully will be lifting. But here, a very visible embargo. Here, the embargo is invisible, that Venezuela cannot get loans, that its creditors are completely unwilling to renegotiate any of the terms of any payment terms. As we just saw, a $5.5 billion debt swap to swap some of the debt that was due next year. The government was hoping to swap it for debt due in 2020. That was rejected by creditors. So there clearly is an attitude of hostility on the part of international banks to provide credit to Venezuela. And while at the same time, international journalists, corporate journalists, attack Venezuela for making its debt payments. So it's kind of a damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. And I think the only solution really is to, that the government has to promote these kinds of grassroots initiatives like the collapse and, try to promote greater transparency and connect open dialogue with grassroots movements that support it.
All right, Lucas, I thank you so much for joining us today, and looking forward to having you back.
Great. Thank you so much for having me, Sharmini. Take care.
And thank you for joining us on the Real News Network.